Hey guys, tonight we step straight into the marble corridors of ancient Rome, where golden lamps glow against polished stone. The smell of wine lingers, and the whispers never seem to stop. You're about to meet a woman who, according to scandal and satire, made emperors tremble, senators gossip, and poets sharpen their pens. Historians called her a menace, poets called her insatiable, and gossip called her a queen of deviance. You probably won't survive this without raising your eyebrows at least once, because the Romans knew how to turn pleasure into spectacle. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because you might fall asleep during this story, and share only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your location and time in the comments. Now, turn off the lights and lie down on your chair or bed. And let's begin tonight's journey together. The scene opens in Rome during the reign of Emperor Claudius, somewhere in the 1st century CE. Within the sprawling palace complex on the Palatine Hill, a young empress named Messalina moves through candlelit chambers with an elegance that hides something more dangerous. She is only in her late teens when she marries Claudius, but she is already known for ambition, boldness, and appetites that do not rest with food or politics alone. To appreciate her scandal, you must first appreciate Roman society. This was an empire where power and pleasure danced together like gladiators in the arena. Feasts lasted until dawn, wine poured freely, and performances could blur into orgies. Yet, Roman moralists, men like Tacitus, Juvenal, and Suetonius, enjoyed writing about depravity almost as much as they condemned it. That means our sources are laced with exaggeration, satire, and outright slander. Historians still argue whether Messalina was truly the embodiment of lust they described, or a victim of political propaganda. Still, the stories about her persist, larger than life. The whispers begin with her youth. Born into the powerful Claudian family, she was connected to emperors and senators, a perfect candidate for a political marriage. Claudius, older, bookish, and often mocked for his limp and stutter, took her as his wife. She bore him children, securing her role as empress. But soon, the palace buzzed with rumors that she found her husband too dull, too distracted by statecraft, and too easy to deceive. Messalina's so-called deviance begins here. The court describes her as prowling the palace at night, seeking lovers among the young and strong. Gladiators, soldiers, dancers, men whose bodies were celebrated in public games, suddenly found themselves whispered about in connection with the Empress. Whether these stories are factual or not, they shaped her legend as a woman whose lust knew no boundaries. Here's a quirky tidbit. Roman gossip even claimed she once disguised herself as a common prostitute, sneaking out of the palace at night to work in a brothel, competing with sex workers for clients just to prove her superiority. Juvenal, the satirist, swore she would leave at dawn, exhausted but triumphant. Was it true? Almost certainly not. But satire made it believable enough to become permanent in her reputation. You can almost picture her slipping back into the palace before the rooster crowed, removing her disguise like an actor at the end of a play. And the emperor? Claudius seemed oblivious, or at least, sources say he preferred not to know. As long as state matters remained stable, he may have turned a blind eye. That created fertile ground for rumor. If the emperor ignored his wife's behavior, the gossip spread twice as fast. Historians still argue whether Claudius genuinely loved Messalina or merely tolerated her as long as she provided heirs. Some suggest he was manipulated by her family, others that he underestimated her cunning. Either way, his silence amplified her legend. Roman society thrived on scandal, and Messalina became its perfect subject. Poets painted her as the Empress of insatiability, the Meretrix Augusta, the imperial harlot. But beneath the caricature, one can sense the fear she evoked. A woman wielding sexuality as power disturbed the Roman male elite, so stories about her excesses multiplied, each more shocking than the last. Imagine the palace corridors at night. Marble echoes under sandaled feet. Guards glance away as veiled figures slip through arches. In one chamber, Messalina holds a private feast, not for senators, but for athletes and entertainers. Wine flows, music plays, and boundaries dissolve. Whether real or imagined, these tales fed the idea that she transformed Rome's palace into a stage of lust. Now for joke number 1. If gossip was currency, Messalina was Rome's central bank. Everyone invested in her scandals, and the returns were always outrageous. The irony is that Rome itself was hardly chaste. Senators who condemned Messalina likely indulged in similar pleasures behind closed doors. But as empress, her behavior, real or invented, was magnified. What would be ordinary gossip about a senator's mistress became legend when attached to the name of the empress. Her youth, beauty, and political position made her irresistible to rumor. And, let's be honest, ancient writers loved a good story. Was she truly more deviant than other Roman women of rank? Historians still argue whether Messalina was uniquely scandalous or simply uniquely slandered. Joke number 2. Think of it as the world's first tabloid journalism, except the tabloids were written in Latin hexameters and read aloud in the forum. As whispers grew, Messalina's image crystallized. A queen of sexual deviance, feasting not on bread and wine, but on the vigor of young men. Whether she sought them in gladiatorial schools, theaters, or banquets, the stories painted her as restless, insatiable, always searching. By the end of this section, you stand at the threshold of her legend. Behind one palace door, the emperor sleeps soundly, unaware or unwilling to know. Behind another, the empress prepares a feast that will scandalize Rome for generations. You are invited to step through that second door, where desire and danger mingle in the glow of torches. And here's joke number 3 before you go in. Rome didn't need Netflix. Messalina's love life was the empire's longest-running series. The night in Rome grows thicker, and so do the whispers. From here, the story will only grow more tangled. Banquets that became carnivals of pleasure. Gladiators pulled into her orbit, and contests of excess that seemed beyond belief. For now, you've met the queen as her legend begins. The palace corridors are open. Do you dare walk further inside? You push open the imagined palace door, and the scent of roasted meat mingled with incense floods your senses. The Palatine Hill feels alive with shadows and echoes. By day, it is a seat of law and empire. But by night, at least in the stories, it becomes Messalina's private stage. Behind those walls, she is not just empress, and wife of Claudius. She is hostess, orchestrator, and according to Rome's gossip mill, a queen who turned her chambers into a theater of appetite. Step deeper, and you see what the satirists wanted you to picture. Rooms draped with silks, golden lamps casting a honeyed glow, tables weighed down with fruit and wine. Guests gather, not senators or generals, but men chosen for beauty, strength, or wit. The night has only just begun, but Messalina is already directing the scene with practiced ease. One mainstream historical fact: Messalina was known in Roman sources, particularly Tacitus and Juvenal, for her supposed affairs and scandals within the imperial palace. While Tacitus, writing in his annals, emphasized her political manipulations, Juvenal, the satirist, delighted in painting her as Rome's most lustful woman. These texts are not neutral accounts. They are laced with moral outrage and sensationalism. Still, they became the foundation of her infamous reputation, repeated through centuries. And behind palace doors, the stories say Messalina indulged freely. The whispers describe lovers brought through secret passages, guards bribed to turn their heads, and chamber doors that opened to gladiators fresh from the arena. Some tales claimed she grew bored with senators and nobles, preferring the raw vitality of performers, soldiers, and athletes. Whether true or exaggerated, the picture is clear. She is remembered not as a dutiful wife, but as a woman whose desires tested the limits of Rome's patience. Here's a quirky tidbit. Roman palaces were enormous complexes, sprawling across the Palatine Hill with multiple wings, gardens, and hidden rooms. It was said you could get lost wandering from the emperor's library to his wife's apartments. For Messalina, this maze provided the perfect setting for secrecy. Doors that could open to unexpected encounters, corridors that muffled sound, courtyards where moonlight itself seemed complicit. Historians still argue whether these nightly escapades truly happened, or whether they were literary inventions designed to slander her. Roman historians often used women as symbols of moral decay, blaming them for the corruption of men. Was Messalina really prowling the palace for lovers? Or was she a convenient scapegoat to highlight Claudius's supposed weakness? Either way, the palace itself became part of her legend, a stage where appetite was dressed in silk and scandal. Picture her now young, striking, and utterly in control of her surroundings. She moves from table to table, pouring wine with her own hands, laughing at a joke from a dancer, brushing past a soldier whose muscles glisten in lamplight. Every movement is deliberate, and every gaze in the room follows her. Claudius, meanwhile, is nowhere in sight, occupied with governance or perhaps simply pretending ignorance. The contrast only adds fuel to the whispers. Joke number 1. If Claudius had installed palace Wi-Fi, half the empire would have been live blogging Messalina's parties. Instead, they settled for gossip in the forum. The stories claim she did not discriminate between classes. A gladiator one night, an actor the next, perhaps even a poet. Her choice was variety, not status. This inversion of Roman norms horrified the elite. For them, class boundaries were sacred. For Messalina, if the stories are to be believed, pleasure was its own rank. That alone made her dangerous, because by stepping outside aristocratic rules, she undermined the hierarchy itself, In the imagination of her enemies, these feasts were not simply indulgence, but rebellion. A woman, and an empress at that, commanding her own circle of pleasure without deference to senators. It was as frightening as it was scandalous. Here's joke number 2. Rome may have had 12 tables of law, but in Messalina's palace, there was only one table, and it was covered in wine cups. Rumors grew faster than ivy on marble. Servants whispered to neighbors. Neighbors whispered to friends. And before long, Messalina's palace nights became common talk in the city streets. "Have you heard?" they asked. "She entertains gladiators in her own rooms." Each retelling added spice until her reputation eclipsed truth. She was transformed into an archetype of deviance, not simply an empress, but a symbol of unrestrained lust. Yet you pause to wonder, how much was fantasy projected onto her? Roman men feared powerful women. And what better way to attack one than to portray her as enslaved to appetite? Still, the consistency of the stories suggests there was at least some truth, that behind the walls of the Palatine, indulgence really did find fertile ground. The night stretches on, music grows louder, the air thicker with wine and incense. A dancer spins, a gladiator flexes, laughter rises to the painted ceilings. Messalina watches it all with a smile that is equal parts satisfaction and defiance. For a moment, you glimpse why her legend survived. Joke number 3. If Airbnb reviews existed back then, her palace would have read, "Great location, endless wine, host a bit too friendly with the gladiators." The door closes softly behind you, leaving the sounds of revelry echoing in your ears. Beyond those chambers, the empire sleeps uneasily, and already the whispers spread. Rome's empress is not simply a wife. She is the mistress of her own decadent world. Soon the rumors will leave the palace entirely, spilling into feasts so wild they become legend. The palace has barely quieted from one feast when another begins. Tonight, the torches burn brighter, and the tables are weighed down not just with food, but with spectacle. To call them banquets feels almost misleading. These were theaters of excess, at least in the way Roman writers wanted you to imagine them. Here, wine was not poured, but spilled, fruit piled in mountains, and silver dishes gleamed with roasted birds. You feel the heat of braziers, the clash of cymbals, and the hum of laughter weaving into something heavier. Feasts of forbidden pleasure. One mainstream historical fact: Roman feasts, especially in the imperial household, were often elaborate affairs. The historian Suetonius describes banquets of earlier emperors like Caligula, with dishes so extravagant they bankrupted treasuries. Under Claudius, feasting continued as a cornerstone of elite life. These meals were not only about nourishment, they were displays of wealth, political alliances, and cultural identity. And when Messalina hosted, rumor claimed, they became something even more: a gateway into hidden pleasures. You imagine the couches arranged around the triclinium, each draped with embroidered linens. Guests recline with cups of Falernian wine, the finest vintage, while slaves carry trays of oysters, figs, and honey cakes. But the real draw is not the food, it is the undercurrent. Performers mingle freely. Gladiators lean casually at the edges. Musicians strum softer tunes that invite intimacy. At the center, Messalina presides, not as dutiful empress, but as orchestrator of indulgence. Here's a quirky tidbit. Romans believed certain foods were aphrodisiacs. Oysters were thought to stir desire, while figs symbolized fertility. Imagine Messalina offering her guests figs with a sly smile, both snack and innuendo. Even garlic, strong and pungent, was sometimes recommended for stamina, though one wonders how romantic garlic breath could really be under candlelight. Historians still argue whether these feasts truly existed as described, or whether satirists exaggerated them into orgies for rhetorical effect. Juvenal, for instance, loved to mock Messalina by portraying her as insatiable, attending banquets that ended in chaos. Tacitus, more sober but still hostile, painted her as dangerously manipulative. Between satire and history, it is nearly impossible to separate fact from fiction. But perhaps that is the point. Her legend thrives in the space between truth and scandal. Picture yourself reclining at one of these feasts. A cup of wine in hand, you hear music swell as dancers enter, their costumes thin enough to reveal more than they hide. Gladiators laugh with actors, musicians flirt with guests, and the entire room feels like a stage without rules. Messalina moves among them, offering a cup here, a whisper there, her presence magnetic. She is both participant and conductor, ensuring the energy never dips. Joke number 1. If Uber Eats had existed, Messalina would have ordered one of everything, plus 3 gladiators on the side. At these banquets, barriers collapsed. Senators, used to sitting stiff in togas, found themselves competing for her attention with common performers. Rome's rigid hierarchy melted away under the influence of wine and Messalina's charm. To some, this was thrilling. To others, terrifying. An empire built on order did not look kindly on an empress who blurred lines so completely. The stories claim these feasts often stretched until dawn. Guests stumbled out, their sandals slipping on spilled wine, their reputations permanently stained. For Messalina, however, the sunrise was simply another curtain call. She thrived on these nights, each one reinforcing her image as Rome's queen of excess. And here's joke number 2. Imagine being a palace slave writing in your diary, cleaned up after another feast, found 3 empty cups, 2 broken lyres, and 1 senator asleep under the table. Standard Tuesday. But beyond the humor, danger lurked. The more lavish the feasts, the louder the whispers in the forum. Senators spoke in hushed tones of an empress who mocked propriety, of a palace turned brothel, of a queen who valued youth and beauty over rank. These whispers were not harmless gossip. They were seeds of political unrest. Messalina, though, seemed unbothered. Accounts portray her as untouchable, confident that Claudius either did not know or did not care. His preoccupation with administration gave her cover, but it also fueled critics who claimed Rome itself was endangered by her unchecked indulgence. As dawn breaks, the last cups are emptied, and torches gutter out. The palace smells of smoke and wine, a haze clinging to marble. Guests stumble into the streets, where gossip immediately takes root. Rome will be buzzing by midday, and Messalina's legend grows with every retelling. Joke number 3. If Yelp existed in ancient Rome, the reviews for her feasts would read food 10-10, entertainment 12-10, reputation after attending year on 10. So the stage is set. Messalina has transformed ordinary banquets into spectacles of forbidden pleasure. But the feasts are only the beginning. Soon, she will pull new figures into her orbit, men whose muscles and youth embodied Rome's ideals of strength. They will not leave unscarred. The lamps have burned low, the laughter has faded, and yet Messalina's appetite, as the stories tell it, does not rest with poets and dancers alone. Rome's satirists saved their sharpest ink for the next act. The gladiators. These men, bronzed and muscled from the amphitheater, embodied raw strength. They fought beasts and men alike for the entertainment of crowds, their names chanted by plebeians and nobles in equal measure. To pull such men into the orbit of an empress was, in Roman eyes, the height of scandal. One mainstream historical fact: gladiators in Rome were often both despised and adored. They were legally infames, disreputable, with no citizen rights. Yet their popularity soared. Crowds admired their courage, their physiques, and their theatrical deaths. Emperors like Commodus even fought in the arena to bask in that same glory. If Messalina truly sought gladiators as lovers, as Juvenal and others claimed, she blurred the line between imperial dignity and public spectacle. Picture the palace again, this time not filled with senators reclining, but with warriors standing tall, their scars still fresh, their bodies honed like marble statues. They are not men of noble birth, but their appeal is undeniable. Messalina, in these tales, moves among them with the same authority she wielded at her feasts, choosing not by status, but by strength. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some gladiators became so famous they had fan clubs. Women left graffiti on walls praising their favorite fighters, even sketching hearts and crude jokes. Imagine Rome's Empress as the most powerful fangirl of them all, except her admiration was whispered to be more than just chalk on a wall. Historians still argue whether Messalina truly entertained gladiators as lovers, or whether her enemies exaggerated to maximize her disgrace. Tacitus, more restrained than Juvenal, still emphasizes her reckless affairs, while Juvenal gleefully paints her as competing with prostitutes for the attention of fighters. Was she truly prowling the gladiator barracks? Or was this a literary invention meant to shock? The debate lingers, feeding her reputation as Rome's queen of deviance. You can almost hear the clash of swords from the Colosseum echoing into the palace halls. By day, gladiators spilled blood for the crowd. By night, rumor said, they satisfied an empress. The contradiction was irresistible to Roman writers. A woman of highest rank seeking men of lowest legal status. It inverted the social order, and nothing scandalized the elite more than inversion. Joke number 1. In modern terms, it would be like a queen swapping her crown for a backstage pass to date the rock stars of the arena. These stories often describe Messalina as restless, moving from one conquest to the next. Some claimed she collected gladiators like trophies, laughing at their eagerness to please the empress. Others imagined her disguising herself, slipping into the gladiatorial schools by night. Whether true or not, the image stuck. Messalina, the empress who craved the strength of men trained for battle. But danger shadowed pleasure. Gladiators were not safe partners. If the emperor discovered such affairs, both the fighter and his patroness risked death. Some stories suggest lovers of Messalina disappeared mysteriously, silenced before gossip reached the Senate. In this way, her passion was painted as fatal, pleasure that consumed not just reputations, but lives. Joke number 2. Imagine being a gladiator told, "Great news, you've been chosen to please the Empress. Bad news, you'll probably die afterward." Not exactly a career perk. The palace corridors grow heavy with implication. Guards look away nervously, servants whisper in corners. Each new rumor fuels Rome's fascination. Was the Empress truly so insatiable? Or was she a convenient symbol of Rome's moral decline? Historians still argue whether her legend reflects her choices or her enemies' anxieties. You pause to consider her power in these stories. She is not portrayed as a victim or a passive figure. Instead, she is active, choosing, commanding, breaking the rules. For male historians, that in itself was threatening. An empress who wielded sexuality like a weapon upset every expectation of Roman femininity. Perhaps that is why her tales endured. They revealed the fears men had of women who could not be controlled. Joke number 3. If gladiators had a union, their bargaining agreement would have included hazard pay for extra palatial duties. So the stories of Messalina and her gladiators spread like wildfire, fueling the idea that Rome's empress lived for deviance. The Colosseum's dust mixed with palace perfume, and in between, her legend grew. But gladiators were only one chapter. Soon, the tales say, she reached further still, drawing in actors and dancers, men whose craft blurred lines between art and intimacy. The palace corridors still echo with the imagined footsteps of gladiators slipping away into the night. But Messalina's hunger, at least in the stories, was never confined to the sand of the arena. Rome was a city where entertainment was life. Theaters pulsed with laughter, pantomimes dazzled crowds, and dancers spun beneath oil lamps. Actors and performers lived on applause, but they were also marked as infames, dishonorable in the rigid Roman social order. To invite them into the palace was to drag the stage into the marble halls, to blur art and intimacy. That, according to gossip, is exactly what Messalina did. One mainstream historical fact: actors and dancers in Rome were considered socially scandalous. Cicero had long condemned actors as immoral, and Augustus once banned senators from attending dinner parties with them. Yet they remained irresistibly popular. Pantomime stars could attract adoring fan bases. Women threw flowers at dancers, and theaters roared with cheers. If Messalina truly entertained such men, she was trampling boundaries more rigid than marble columns. Picture the scene. A troupe of musicians enters the imperial hall. Lutes hum, flutes trill, dancers in thin garments twirl across the floor. But the performance doesn't end on stage. It flows into the couches where wine already clouds judgment. Messalina, in the center, applauds not as a passive spectator, but as a hostess who sees the line between performance and pleasure vanish. By midnight, the feast becomes something else. Theater without audience, art without script. Here's a quirky tidbit. Roman pantomime dancers were so adored that women sometimes paid for locks of their hair as keepsakes. Some men even tattooed their favorite actors' names on their arms. Imagine Rome's Empress deciding she wanted more than a souvenir. She wanted the actor himself, waiting not in the wings, but in her bedchamber. Historians still argue whether Messalina truly broke this taboo, or whether satirists exaggerated her reach to paint her as insatiable. Tacitus mentions her manipulations of men in politics. Juvenal gleefully adds the actors and pantomimes, spinning her into a caricature of endless lust. Was she hosting orgiastic performances, or were these simply metaphors turned literal in satire? The uncertainty itself kept her legend alive. In your mind's eye, you see her moving among the performers. She praises a dancer's grace, runs her hand across a musician's shoulder, laughs at an actor's mimicry. Each gesture, magnified by rumor, becomes another notch in her reputation. The palace, once a symbol of imperial discipline, turns in gossip into a theater where the curtain never falls. Joke number 1. If Netflix had existed, Messalina wouldn't have watched the show. She would have invited the entire cast over afterward. To the Roman elite, the scandal wasn't just in who she chose, but in what those choices represented. Gladiators and actors were adored by the masses, but despised by the aristocracy. Messalina's alleged affairs blurred the line between ruler and performer, between empress and commoner. It was a violation of Rome's sense of order, a symbolic undoing of hierarchy. And yet, you pause again. Perhaps the stories say more about male anxiety than about her actual life. A woman exercising freedom to choose her companions, especially companions outside the Senate class, was threatening to those who built power on rigid class distinctions. By slandering her with tales of actors and dancers, her enemies painted her as an empress who preferred stagecraft to statesmanship. Joke number 2. Imagine the Roman Senate group chat if it existed. Breaking news. Messalina seen with pantomime actor again. Outrage. Followed by 50 eye-roll emojis. But the tales grew darker too. Some claimed that the performers who pleased her were rewarded with gifts and influence, while those who failed vanished from Rome's gossip entirely. Whether invention or truth, the implication was clear. Intimacy with the Empress could elevate or destroy. The palace by night becomes a kaleidoscope. Gladiators one evening, actors the next, dancers weaving between couches like shadows with bells on their ankles. Rome buzzes with rumor, unable to decide whether to condemn her or secretly envy her freedom. And here's joke number 3. If talent agencies had existed in Rome, their biggest selling point would have been, yes, our actors perform for the Empress herself. Reviews guaranteed, the stories of gladiators and performers fold together, each adding a layer to her reputation as the queen of deviance. But legend does not rest there. Soon, Roman gossip would claim she pushed her indulgence even further, transforming appetite into competition, hosting contests to prove just how insatiable she was. The lamps are brighter tonight, the couches more numerous, the wine stronger, and the whispers more dangerous. Rome's gossip insists that Messalina was no longer satisfied with feasts that blurred art and intimacy. She wanted to prove herself beyond rumor, to test the very limits of pleasure and stamina. And so the stories paint her next move not as simple indulgence, but as competition. Her excess becomes spectacle, her lust measured not in whispers, but in contests. One mainstream historical fact: the satirist Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century CE, describes Messalina as challenging a leading courtesan of Rome to a contest of endurance, to see who could sleep with more partners in one night. According to him, Messalina won, outlasting even the professional. Historians widely agree this is satire, exaggeration intended to shock and entertain, but the tale stuck, cementing her image as the ultimate symbol of female excess in Roman memory. Picture the chamber as Juvenal wanted you to: torches blazing, the air heavy with incense, a crowd of attendants secretly watching. On one side, a famed courtesan, practiced in the arts of seduction. On the other, Messalina, Empress of Rome, confident and defiant. The contest begins, each encounter tallied, each man leaving more astonished than the last. By dawn, the courtesan collapses, and Messalina, legend claims, rises triumphant, demanding still more. Whether true or not, the story became immortal, whispered as proof of her insatiability. Here's a quirky tidbit. Roman culture loved competitions of all sorts: chariot races, gladiator battles, poetry duels. Even dining itself could be a contest, with nobles boasting about who ate more delicacies or drank more wine. To recast Messalina's indulgence as a contest fit neatly into Roman imagination. They turned her excess into sport, a game with rules, winners, and losers. Historians still argue whether this tale reveals anything real about Messalina, or whether it was simply a satirical device to embody fears of female sexuality gone unchecked. Some scholars note that by the time Juvenal wrote, nearly 50 years after her death, her story had already hardened into myth. He was less describing a woman than creating a symbol: the Empress who competed with prostitutes and won. Imagine the senators hearing this rumor by daylight. Their faces pale, their voices tremble. Not only had Messalina broken every rule of modesty, but she had turned it into a public sport. If game was supposed to stand for discipline, order, and hierarchy, this story turned its Empress into the champion of chaos. Joke number 1. If Guinness World Records had existed, Messalina's page would have been bookmarked with wine stains. Yet beneath the exaggeration lies something revealing. These stories reflect how Romans weaponized sexuality to discredit women in power. A man with many lovers was celebrated. A woman with the same was vilified. By portraying Messalina as competitive in lust, they magnified her threat. She was not only indulgent, she was victorious in the realm men thought was theirs alone. The tale also casts her as restless, a figure who found no limit, who sought novelty, not because she lacked lovers, but because she craved conquest. Whether or not she ever staged such a contest, the image of her rising at dawn, smug in victory, was irresistible to Rome's satirists. Here's joke number 2. Imagine the gossip scrolls the next morning. Breaking: Empress wins after-hours contest. Loser retires early, citing exhaustion. Sources say she demanded a rematch. For ordinary Romans, the story was both scandal and entertainment. Vendors likely repeated it in marketplaces, dramatizing her triumph as if it were a gladiatorial spectacle. Children might have overheard, and asked embarrassing questions, while moralists clutched their togas and declared Rome doomed. In this way, the tale outgrew her life. It became cultural shorthand. When you wanted to talk about excess, you talked about Messalina. But every contest has consequences. By framing her indulgence as limitless, Rome's writers made her seem unstoppable, a force of appetite that no husband, no senate, no empire could restrain. That made her dangerous, not just scandalous. And danger, in Rome, always called forth enemies. Joke number 3. If Rome had had ESPN, this would have been billed as the Lust Games, Empress versus Courtesan. No tickets left. The torches dim. The contest fades into rumor. But the damage is permanent. Messalina is no longer just a young empress rumored to entertain gladiators and actors. She is now remembered as the victor of Rome's most infamous competition of excess. And when a woman wins such a contest, the men of Rome cannot help but sharpen their knives, both metaphorical and literal. From here, her story begins to tangle with politics. Rivals at court grow bolder, whispering to Claudius, plotting in shadows. What began as scandal in the night becomes intrigue in the daylight. Messalina's feasts are no longer private. They are ammunition in Rome's dangerous game of power. The echoes of laughter from Messalina's infamous contests have barely faded when another sound begins to rise. Whispers in marble corridors, murmurs in shaded atriums, rumors that twist into sharpened words. Rome is a city that thrives on scandal, and Messalina's excesses, whether true or invented, become the perfect fuel for jealous rivals at court. Women of noble families especially, bound by rules of modesty and carefully guarded reputations, find themselves both fascinated and horrified. They talk of her behind fans at feasts, in perfumed courtyards, their envy tangled with disdain. One mainstream historical fact: Roman women of the elite were expected to embody pudicitia, a public display of chastity and modesty. Statues of pudicitia adorned forums, a constant reminder of how women were supposed to behave. To flout this expectation, as Messalina supposedly did, was to undermine one of Rome's most cherished virtues. Her contemporaries, especially other noblewomen, would have been quick to weaponize gossip against her. Imagine the scene: a banquet hosted by a senator's wife. As musicians strum softly in the background, the women lean closer, voices lowered, but eyes gleaming. "Did you hear?" one whispers, "that the Empress held another feast, this time with gladiators?" Another adds, "Actors too, and dancers. It's said she held contests." Each rumor grows in the retelling, polished into something scandalous enough to reach the ears of their husbands by nightfall. Here's a quirky tidbit. Roman women often gathered at public baths reserved for them, where conversations flowed as freely as water. Though historians rarely recorded their chatter, it is not hard to imagine Messalina's name echoing in those steamy chambers, her reputation debated as women compared their own tightly restricted lives with the freedoms she was rumored to seize. Historians still argue whether the intensity of Messalina's scandal came more from her actual actions or from the way Roman society magnified them through envy and resentment. Was she truly more deviant than others, or simply the most visible target for those who resented her youth, beauty, and power? You see noblewomen begin to align with senators and courtiers who also bristled at Messalina's unchecked behavior. The women whispered, the men plotted. Together, they formed a dangerous chorus. One half scandalized, the other half ambitious. To bring down Messalina was not only moral revenge, but political opportunity. Joke number 1. Think of it as Rome's first Mean Girls Club. Except the gossip wasn't about who wore what toga, but who entertained which gladiator. Their envy carried weight because it was tied to power. Noble women, whose husbands feared Messalina's influence, saw her as both rival and threat. If the Empress could command men with beauty and desire, what did that mean for carefully negotiated marriages? For alliances built on bloodlines rather than allure? To them, Messalina wasn't just scandalous, she was destabilizing. The gossip began to curdle into action. Allies at court began whispering to Claudius's advisors, sowing doubt about his wife's loyalty. To suggest infidelity was one thing. To suggest disloyalty to the empire was far worse. Slowly, Messalina's personal reputation became a political liability. Joke number 2. Somewhere in Rome, a senator probably said, "I'm not jealous, I'm just concerned for the empire." The ancient version of asking for a friend. Even as noble women sharpened rumors against her, Messalina seemed undeterred. The stories suggest she carried on with the same confidence, believing herself untouchable. But in politics, perception is as deadly as reality. Each banquet, each whispered contest, each rumor of gladiators or actors added stones to the pile her enemies were building. One day, perhaps at the baths or in the porticos, a noblewoman muttered, "If the Empress can behave this way and go unpunished, what will happen to the rest of us?" The question, rhetorical though it was, planted itself in Rome's collective conscience. If Messalina could trample Pudicitia and remain Empress, then virtue itself seemed meaningless. That thought made enemies of anyone who valued order, or claimed to. Joke number 3. You could say Messalina wasn't just living rent-free in Rome's palace. She was living rent-free in everyone else's head too. So jealousy thickened the air. Noble women spread their whispers, senators gathered their suspicions, and the court began to fracture around Messalina's shadow. She had turned the palace into her private theater, but now the audience was hostile, and the reviews were turning lethal. Soon, the emperor himself would no longer be able to ignore the mounting chorus of disapproval. The palace grows quieter in the mornings, but beneath the surface, something uneasy stirs. Messalina, young and vibrant, continues her feasts and rumored escapades, yet the empire waits for the other sandal to drop. At the center of this stillness stands Emperor Claudius, her husband. History remembers him as an odd figure, scholarly, awkward, mocked in his youth for a limp and a stammer, but unexpectedly elevated to emperor after Caligula's assassination. Claudius, seated on the throne of the world, seems curiously blind, or perhaps willfully blind, to the storms brewing in his own household. One mainstream historical fact. Ancient sources describe Claudius as deeply absorbed in administrative work and scholarship. He wrote histories, studied law, and focused heavily on governing. In Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars, Claudius is depicted as pedantic and bookish, a man more at home with scrolls than with palace intrigue. This made him appear, at least in hindsight, vulnerable to manipulation by those closest to him, including his ambitious wives and freedmen advisors. So, while rumors of Messalina's affairs grew, Claudius often appeared preoccupied. The satirists sneered that he was too absorbed in legal minutiae to notice what everyone else in Rome was whispering. To them, it was comedic. An emperor overseeing the empire's laws, while his wife oversaw midnight orgies. Whether Claudius truly ignored it or simply chose not to act remains one of the great questions. Historians still argue whether he was genuinely naive or pragmatically tolerant until scandal touched politics itself. Imagine Claudius in his study, surrounded by scrolls, dictating an edict on aqueduct maintenance while messengers outside whispered of Messalina's latest banquet. A guard passes, unsure whether to speak. A servant coughs, hesitates, and decides silence is safer. The emperor's pen scratches on, oblivious, or pretending to be. Here's a quirky tidbit. Claudius had a fascination with mushrooms. Ancient gossip even claimed he adored them so much that his eventual death by poisoning came through a dish of mushrooms, though whether that story is true is another scholarly debate. Picture him at dinner, savoring a plate of fungi while Rome buzzed about Messalina's deviance. The empire might crumble, but the emperor's mushrooms were perfectly seasoned. Joke number 1. Claudius probably set the ancient record for husband most likely to say, "What rumors? I've been reading all day." Yet ignoring scandal had its costs. For the emperor of Rome, perception mattered as much as reality. A ruler whose household seemed corrupted risked appearing weak. And weakness was dangerous in an empire still remembering the chaos of Caligula. Advisors and senators began to see Messalina's escapades not merely as personal embarrassment, but as threats to the dignity of the throne itself. Still, Claudius delayed. Why? Some historians suggest genuine affection. Messalina bore him children, including Octavia and Britannicus, and he may have loved her despite her reputation. Others argue it was calculation. As long as she gave him heirs and her family connections kept the Claudian dynasty strong, he could stomach the gossip. Whatever the reason, his inaction gave Messalina space to build her legend further. Joke number 2. Think of it as the ultimate see no evil, hear no evil marriage, except the whole empire saw and heard everything. But silence also invited opportunists. Courtiers realized that if Claudius ignored rumors, they might manipulate him when it suited their own ambitions. Rivalries at court sharpened, each side deciding whether to tolerate Messalina or use her scandals to topple her. Claudius, scribbling away at edicts, might have thought himself safe in his study. In truth, his indifference only made the knives around him sharper. Meanwhile, Messalina seemed emboldened by his inaction. If the emperor himself looked away, why should she restrain herself? The rumors escalated. Banquets became orgies in the telling. Lovers multiplied in the whispers, and her reputation ballooned into caricature. Whether or not she indulged to the extent described, Rome came to believe she lived unchecked, and belief was enough to stain her forever. Joke number 3. If Claudius had owned a diary, it would have read, "Today, I reorganized grain shipments. Wife, no idea what she's up to. Probably knitting." Spoiler, not knitting. Thus, Claudius's blindness, or his refusal to act, became part of the myth. The emperor, who busied himself with scrolls, while his wife busied herself with gladiators, actors, and contests. His negligence shaped her story as much as her actions did. For her enemies, it was proof that Rome itself was endangered. ruled by a distracted husband and a deviant queen. Soon, poets would sharpen their pens, turning private scandal into public satire. Messalina's reputation would leave the palace altogether and enter the streets, immortalized in words that stung sharper than swords. You leave Claudius in his study with his mushrooms and scrolls and walk back into the streets where reputations are made and unmade by ink. You can almost hear the scratch of styluses on wax, the murmur of reciters in porticos, the laugh that ripples through a crowd when a good line lands. In Rome, poets are not just entertainers, they are weapons. If Messalina rules the night with rumor, the poets rule the day with verses, and tonight you step into their workshop, a city that polishes scandal into literature. You pause at a bookseller's stall near the Forum. Rolls of papyrus lie like sleeping snakes, their titles inked on little tags. A young man leans against a pillar, clearing his throat theatrically. He recites a few lines. A circle forms. This is where reputations are forged, in the open air, with the city as judge. A poem, once spoken, can travel faster than a messenger. Once copied, it can travel as far as the empire. For Messalina, that is both immortality and doom. One mainstream historical fact: the satirist Juvenal, late 1st, early 2nd century CE, paints Messalina as the archetype of imperial depravity, especially in Satire 6, where he tells of her sneaking from the palace to work all night in a brothel, then returning at dawn, sated but not satisfied. Whether you believe him or not, Juvenal's lines gave later ages their most enduring image of her. Meanwhile, the historian Tacitus, less flamboyant but no less lethal, records her political scheming and, crucially, the scandal of her marriage to the handsome Gaius Silius while Claudius was away. Between Tacitus's prose and Juvenal's fireworks, her legend sets like concrete. The reciter at the stall switches to a biting epigram in the style of Martial, Rome's king of quick stings. Martial once mocked actors, fops, and dinner hosts with the economy of a dagger thrust. You imagine him crafting two perfect lines that turn Messalina into a rumor you can memorize. You see how it works. Tacitus gives the architecture. Juvenal lights it on fire. Martial chisels the plaque. Here's a quirky tidbit. Public readings could be more chaotic than dignified. Pet parrots were trained to squawk favorite lines. Hecklers coughed loudly to throw a poet off his rhythm. And some friends hired claqueurs, professional applauders, to make a mediocre recitation sound like genius. Imagine Messalina hearing that a poet's hired clappers were knocking her. She would need her own clack just to keep up. You walk toward the theater quarter. On street corners, boys chalk caricatures on walls. Fat senators, vain actors, and yes, an empress with a too-wide smile. Graffiti becomes a kind of civic footnote. In Pompeii, before Vesuvius ended the conversation, lovers scratched boasts into stucco, and gamblers boasted of wins. If Rome had emojis, they would be these crude sketches. A rumor about Messalina needs only a few strokes, a diadem, a Dora jar, a line of men like ants. The city specializes in converting moral panic into performance. Pantomime dancers can slip a joke into a gesture. A mime can turn a scandal into a sketch without naming names, and everyone still gets it. The line between poem and play blurs. You sit at the back of a makeshift stage and watch a clown in a woman's crown chase a line of swaggering gladiators across the floor while the audience roars. It is about no one. It is about everyone. It is about her. Historians still argue whether such popular satire responded to elite texts or created them. Did Juvenal amplify street jokes, or did the streets echo Juvenal? The feedback loop matters less than the effect. Messalina becomes a character you can buy in a book, laugh at in a mime show, and repeat at dinner. Once she is a character, she is less a person, and characters cannot sue. You drift into a dinner where a minor noble reads a new piece. He calls it a moral satire, which is Roman for, "You can't prove I meant the Empress." The guests chuckle. A few glance nervously at the door. Even laughter has politics. A generous host supplies wine, but the real intoxication is the joke. Sharp enough to draw blood. Safe enough to deny if the Praetorians come knocking. Joke number 1. Roman libel law existed, but the loophole was simple. Say it in dactylic hexameter, and suddenly it's social commentary. What makes the verse so potent is its vocabulary of fear. The poets claim Messalina's indulgence is not just personal sin. It threatens Mos Mairum, the ancestral way. They compare her to mythical monsters, to Cleopatra, Rome's favorite villainess, to every cautionary tale at once. If Claudius is the sleepy shepherd of the empire, Messalina is the wolf. Accuracy is optional. Imagery is everything. The copyist shows you his wax tablet. He is taking down a clean version for a patron, a version with names shaved off and replaced by clever circumlocutions. The patron will read it aloud safely. Everyone will nod, knowing exactly whom he means. That is the genius of Roman satire. Plausibly deniable, relentlessly specific. Joke number 2. It's like subtweeting in Latin. No at mentions, maximum damage. You pass the Acta Diurna, the public notice board. Official news posts here. Edicts, trials, triumphs. Not Messalina. Her news lives in the parallel paper of rumor, a daily gazette of whispers. Yet sometimes lines blur. A magistrate investigates a scandalized freedman. A senator delivers a speech on public morals. A censor posts a decree about theaters. Each official move nods toward the unofficial queen of conversation without writing her name. You feel the city itself perform a ritual. Rumor, verse, performance, posture. Men who never met Messalina rehearse opinions as if the gods asked for them. Some clutch pearls, some rub hands. A poet drinks too much and recites the brothel story again. The audience laughs as if hearing it for the first time. Repetition is how myth hardens. Meanwhile, the poets sharpen what the court ladies began in whispers. They recast jealousy as moral philosophy. If the Empress can live like this, what becomes of virtue, they ask, then answer with elaborate metaphors about collapsing roofs and fouled springs. Paint a roof sagging often enough, and people look up, expecting tiles to fall. Joke number 3. If Rome had a trending list, #Messalina would sit at number 1 indefinitely, with Claudius reading stubbornly at 12. You can't help noticing how often the poets compare her lovers to athletes and actors, bodies that symbolize vigor, but lack the dignity of rank. This choice does double duty. It shames the Empress and flatters anxious senators who fear being replaced by men with more charisma than pedigree. The verse reassures them. Desire may be potent, but law still belongs to us. For now, A final recitation ends with an image of Messalina as a lamp that never goes out, a flame that devours oil and wick alike. The audience sighs, part scold, part thrill. Such images stick to memory the way smoke clings to hair. By the time you step into the night, you can't recall where Tacitus stops and Juvenal begins, where scurrilous mime ends and sober history starts. That is the poet's victory. They make you forget the seam. Historians still argue whether their Messalina bears any resemblance to the woman herself. Was she a political operator smeared by men who needed a cautionary emblem? Was she reckless and powerful in ways that threatened fragile egos? Or was she both? Reckless and then opportunistically exaggerated into myth. The debate is its own poem, rewritten each generation. What you do know is this: words have mass here. Verses settle onto desks in the palace, drift into the ears of advisors, and finally, inevitably, reach Claudius, not as jokes, but as charges. Satire becomes dossier. And once that happens, the stage lights dim and the courtroom lamps are lit. As you turn back toward the Palatine, the sound of a final couplet follows you like a thrown pebble. Clever, cruel, catchy. The poets have done their work. They have made appetites into crimes, parties into plots, lovers into liabilities. Next, the liability will fall hardest on the men closest to her, those chosen for beauty, strength, or wit, the ones the poems call lucky until the luck runs out. The laughter of poets lingers like smoke over the city. But beneath the humor lies something far more dangerous. Those who once reveled in Messalina's orbit now begin to feel the weight of her shadow. For the men she drew close, gladiators, actors, dancers, and courtiers, the line between pleasure and peril was razor thin. To be chosen by the Empress could mean gifts, favor, and nights of intoxicating luxury. It could also mean ruin, disgrace, or even death. Rome, after all, was not a forgiving city when it came to scandals tied to the throne. One mainstream historical fact: ancient sources agree that Messalina's lovers did not always fare well. Tacitus, in his annals, records that when her affairs became too public, men associated with her faced sudden executions or quiet disappearances. Rome's imperial palace was not a sanctuary. It was a stage where power dictated survival. A man who pleased the Empress one evening could be condemned by dawn if his presence became politically inconvenient. Imagine a gladiator who had basked in the cheers of the Colosseum one afternoon and whispered with Messalina by torchlight that night. By morning, he vanishes from the training school, his name no longer painted on the barracks wall. A dancer who twirled too close to her at a feast might find himself exiled to the provinces. Even senators rumored to be in her circle could lose wealth or influence overnight. In her presence, passion and peril were inseparable. Here's a quirky tidbit. Roman households often kept small wax masks, imagines of ancestors, to remind family members of their lineage. Imagine the irony of a nobleman once linked to Messalina, his family proudly displaying ancestor masks while whispering nervously about how one mistake with the Empress might erase their future generations. In Rome, memory was both pride and punishment. Historians still argue whether Messalina's lovers were true partners in her pursuits or whether many were pawns, men flattered, flung into her orbit, and discarded when the risks outweighed the rewards. Some suggest that the stories of executions were exaggerated propaganda meant to make her seem monstrous. Others point to the undeniable records of sudden deaths, suggesting that her personal indulgence did indeed intersect lethally with imperial paranoia. Picture the imperial guards, silent and watchful. They knew the drill. Escort a man quietly through the back gate, blade glinting in lamplight, return before dawn. For them, it was routine, just another imperial order. For the unlucky lover, it was the price of being too close to Rome's most infamous woman. Joke number 1. Being Messalina's lover was like holding political office. You enjoyed the perks, but your retirement plan was almost always fatal. And yet, the allure remained. Messalina's reputation for beauty and youth, her charm and authority, were powerful magnets. Men still risked themselves, some willingly, others perhaps drawn in by her command. The thrill of her attention outweighed the fear of consequence, at least until the consequence arrived. The stories claim she could be generous, showering lovers with gifts, estates, or introductions to power, but generosity tied to passion was volatile. What she gave one day, she could revoke the next. Worse still, if rivals whispered their suspicions to Claudius or the Senate, the man who had basked in her affection became evidence in a trial he never saw coming. Joke number 2. Imagine the Roman version of dating advice. If she's beautiful, powerful, and married to the emperor, maybe swipe left. Rome loved to dramatize these fates. Poets retold the stories with glee, painting lovers as moths circling a flame, dazzled until their wings burned. It was theater for the masses, but for the men themselves it was a reality of fear. Some might have longed to escape her orbit, yet once chosen, refusal itself could be dangerous. To deny the Empress was nearly as risky as to accept her. In your mind, you see a nobleman trembling as he dresses for a feast, unsure whether to sit close or far, unsure whether her gaze will fall on him. If it does, his life may change forever. If it doesn't, he may sigh in relief, only to watch another take his place at her side. Every choice is a gamble, every glance a wager. Joke number 3. The palace must have been the worst dating app in history. Matches came instantly, but so did executions. Thus, the lovers of Messalina were trapped in a paradox. To win her favor was to court destruction. To resist her was to risk insult or suspicion. No matter what, the palace walls became their cage. Some disappeared into oblivion. Others lived just long enough to see their downfall turned into poetry for Rome's amusement. And in the end, their dangerous fates foreshadowed her own. For just as her lovers could not escape the consequences of proximity, neither could she. The empire's patience was wearing thin, and the line between rumor and reality was closing fast. Soon, the whispers would no longer target only her companions. They would rise against Messalina herself. The air in Rome feels heavier now, as though the very marble of the Forum has learned to carry secrets. Messalina's lovers had already begun to vanish, their names swallowed in silence, but the city itself could not stop talking. If anything, the hush of executions only amplified the volume of gossip. Streets became echo chambers where scandal was currency, and Messalina's reputation was traded more fiercely than grain. One mainstream historical fact: by the 40s CE, when Messalina's star burned brightest and most dangerously, Rome was a city obsessed with rumor. The Acta Diurna, Rome's official daily notices, posted news of court cases, senatorial decrees, and imperial events. But beneath those stone tablets lived a parallel paper of gossip, passed from tavern to tavern, whispered in bathhouses, and scratched onto walls as graffiti. In this shadow press, Messalina was the headline nearly every day. Imagine a bustling marketplace. Merchants shout about olives and oil. Fishmongers slap their catch onto wooden slabs. Children dart between stalls. Yet in every corner, whispers thread the air. Did you hear about last night's feast? They say she outlasted even the courtesans. A senator's son has disappeared. Was he too close to her? By afternoon, the rumors are embroidered. The senator's son becomes a gladiator. The gladiator becomes an actor, and the actor becomes 20 men, all in one night. Exaggeration is the lifeblood of gossip. Here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists studying graffiti in Pompeii found everything from love notes to insults. One wall reads, "Secundus loves Iris, who doesn't return his affection." Another boasts, "Artemides got me pregnant." It isn't hard to imagine similar lines about Messalina, crude sketches of an empress's diadem beside stick-figure gladiators, scratched by a mischievous hand. Public walls were Rome's ancient social media feeds, messy and unfiltered. Historians still argue whether Messalina's legend was inflated by this endless gossip cycle. Was she truly the most scandalous woman in Rome, or did repetition magnify her beyond proportion? Some scholars argue she became a canvas for Rome's anxieties about women, about class, about imperial power, projected into a single figure until the real woman was almost lost beneath the caricature. At night, the gossip took on another shape: performances in taverns and street theaters. A mime might don a crown and mock a drunken empress chasing after gladiators. A pantomime dancer might include a sly gesture that alluded to Messalina, earning knowing laughter. Everyone understood without a name spoken. To joke about her was safer than to speak of Claudius directly, but the effect was the same: ridicule for the imperial household. Joke number 1. In Rome, satire was basically the Wi-Fi. Every scandal went viral instantly, and you didn't even need a password. For ordinary citizens, Messalina's scandal was entertainment. Rome could feel heavy with taxes, fires, and political unrest, but stories of the Empress's nightly exploits offered distraction. For elites, though, gossip was more dangerous. Each new rumor chipped away at Claudius's credibility. How could a man rule an empire when his wife ruled the knights? It wasn't just her reputation at stake. It was his. Senators began to murmur louder. Some framed their complaints as moral outrage. Others, more practical, saw an opportunity to weaken Claudius by attacking Messalina. Either way, whispers in the forum were turning into questions in the Curia. The gossip was climbing the social ladder, from tavern benches to marble floors. Joke number 2. Think of it as a pyramid scheme of scandal. One tavern drunk tells 10 bathhouse gossips, who tell 100 senators' wives, who tell the entire Senate. Even children caught the buzz. Imagine a boy running through the streets, chanting a mocking rhyme about the Empress. He doesn't understand its meaning, but the adults laugh nervously and shush him. The rhyme spreads anyway, turning Messalina's name into a playground taunt. Once scandal becomes children's rhyme, it is almost impossible to erase. And so the public whispers grew into a roar, until Rome itself seemed divided. The palace insisting on silence, the streets shouting endlessly. The louder the city gossiped, the more Claudius looked weak, and the more Messalina appeared untouchable. But appearances never last long in Rome. Joke number 3. If hashtags had existed, Rome's trending list would have been hashtag Messalina, gladiator boyfriend, and Claudius still doesn't know. By now, you sense the tension snapping tighter. Rumor has become too loud, satire too sharp, envy too bitter. Something had to break. And break it would, when Messalina, bold or reckless, staged an act that turned whispers into an open scandal. Her mock marriage to another man, while still Claudius's wife. By now, Rome buzzes like a hive, but the next rumor doesn't creep. It explodes. You hear it first as a ridiculous joke, then as a scandal, and finally as a report with witnesses. The Empress, Messalina, has married another man while still the wife of Emperor Claudius. You blink as if smoke got in your eyes. A wedding? Not a whispered liaison, not a secret tryst, but a full ceremony with garlands, guests, and vows. The city inhales once, sharply, and forgets how to exhale. The man is Gaius Silius, young, beautiful, ambitious, a rising star with pedigree bright enough to light a forum at midnight. One mainstream historical fact anchors this madness. Tacitus, in Annals 11, reports that Messalina and Silius celebrated a marriage with traditional rites while Claudius was out of Rome, and that Silius was even consul designate, the office slated for him in the coming year. It's not a back alley promise. It's a ceremony with public trappings, the kind of act that looks less like lust and more like coup. You stand, in your mind's eye, at the edge of the atrium where it happens. Torches lift their little suns. Musicians hum a gentle thread. A priest raises his hand. The couple approaches the altar with the serenity of people who have mistaken thunder for silence. She wears a veil. Imagine the flammeum, the orange flame of Roman bridal cloth, drawn over hair perfumed with myrtle. He offers his right hand for the dextrarum iunctio, the clasp that seals a union. Guests, some delighted, some terrified, pretend not to hear the thud of an emperor's name hitting the floor. Here's a quirky tidbit. At Roman weddings, nuts were sometimes tossed to children as a sign the groom was leaving childish things behind. A wedding cry, Talasio, could rise like a cheer. Picture someone nervously lobbing a handful of almonds and immediately wondering if they've just committed treason with snacks. How could this happen? Tacitus says Silius pressed for it, arguing that danger was inevitable and that a marriage, brazen and public, would force a decision before enemies struck. If that is true, then this isn't just a bedroom story, it's chess in a lightning storm. Maybe Silius believed that once they stood as husband and wife, the army or the Senate or fortune would fall in line. Maybe Messalina believed Rome would bend to desire, dressed as destiny. Or maybe, as rumor likes to insist, both believed their beauty could outrun law. Joke number 1. Somewhere a slave is filling out the wedding register. Bride, Empress of Rome. Groom, Consul Designate. RSVP regrets, the Emperor. Historians still argue whether this marriage was legal theater or delirious fantasy. Roman law didn't have a twitchy backspace key. You couldn't simply marry while already married, especially if your spouse was the state. Some scholars see the rite as a symbolic declaration, a dare thrown at the throne. Others suggest a ritual intoxicated by hubris, or a trap engineered by enemies who let the pair hang themselves with garlands. The sources agree on the ceremony. They diverge on motive. News runs faster than wheels. Claudius is away. At Ostia, some say, sacrificing. Others insist. Another whisper claims he's inspecting public works, because nothing sets the mood for imperial matrimony like sewers. What matters is absence. Into that gap, Silius and Messalina place vows bold enough to scorch paper. Freedmen at court, Narcissus above all. Here, blanch, and begin to orchestrate a response that sounds like panic disguised as policy. Back in the atrium, the couple smiles like victors. There are witnesses, gifts, even a bed prepared for that ritual first night. Imagine the boldness of laying out sheets, while a throne still warm with your husband's weight sits just up the hill. Servants move with the haunted efficiency of people who know history is happening and would like to be somewhere else when it finishes. Joke number 2. The palace herald drafting the announcement probably tried, "By the way, Rome, quick update," and then ran out of wax tablet. You examine the scene as a scholar might, lightly, sleepily, with your ear to the floorboards of rumor. Is this love? Strategy? Folly? Tacitus leans toward political calculus. Silius, seeing danger in proximity to the Empress, gambles on legitimacy through marriage. Juvenal, never to be outslandered, turns it into shameless spectacle. Between the two, you sense a third possibility. That power and appetite, braided too tight, stopped feeling like separate ropes. All around, Rome performs the only ritual it truly knows: interpretation. Some say Messalina plans to install Silius and sideline Claudius, using the prestige of a consul-to-be as cover for dynastic reshuffle. Others insist she's intoxicated by victory, by midnights, by her own legend, and blundered into a public ceremony because secrets had grown boring. A few mutter that enemies engineered the entire thing to corner her. Historians still argue whether this was audacity, delusion, or trap. You file the possibilities like herbs in labeled jars and keep walking. Meanwhile, Narcissus moves. He summons the Praetorian prefect, gathers key freedmen, and chooses speed over ceremony. The plan, whispered like a knife: reach Claudius first, flood him with facts before Messalina's allies can flood him with tears, and drag the emperor, bewildered and mushroom-loving, straight to the barracks where the soldiers will answer to their paymaster, not their pity. It is crisis management by sprint. And what of the guests at this alarming wedding? Tacitus hints at senators present, men who smiled into their cups while their souls tried to remember where they left their spines. They will claim later they were coerced, that saying no to an empress is a death sentence, even on a happy day. Perhaps, or perhaps they loved the glitter until it turned to glass. Rome keeps poor receipts for courage. Joke number 3. Something borrowed, something blue, something old, something legally impeachable. Night falls on vows that cannot stand daylight. The bed is warm. The city is feverish. The messengers are already galloping. You step back from the atrium and feel the air thin. Pleasure, for years, has flirted with danger. Tonight, they elope. By morning, this will not be a story about desire. It will be a story about state. The marriage makes everything prosecutable. Lovers become traitors. Feasts become evidence. A veil becomes a banner. You listen for hoofbeats. Somewhere beyond the walls, Claudius is being told a version of his life that no husband or emperor wants to hear. Narcissus will pour words like cold water, gather soldiers like shutters against a storm, and lead his trembling master into a city that suddenly looks like a courtroom. In the palace, lamps gutter and shadows lengthen. Messalina may still be laughing, or perhaps she already senses the draft under the door. Either way, the garlands are wilted by dawn, and Rome, which has refinished scandal into entertainment for so long, turns its appetite toward punishment. The enemies who envied her begin to move as one. What began as a wedding ends as an indictment, and you can feel the city's breath return, sharp, hungry, judicial. The next step is inevitable. Plots that drank rumor now dine on retribution. The garlands from that fateful wedding are still wilting when the knives of politics come out. Rome's corridors, always alive with whispers, now hum with coordinated purpose. Those who envied, feared, or despised Messalina sense their moment has arrived. Her mock marriage to Silius was not simply scandal, it was ammunition, and her enemies are eager archers. One mainstream historical fact. According to Tacitus, the freedman Narcissus played a decisive role in orchestrating Messalina's downfall. Along with Claudius's other advisors, Narcissus saw the marriage as an unforgivable act of treason, a blatant insult to the emperor and the throne. He rushed to inform Claudius before Messalina's allies could twist the story. In a panic, the imperial court began to move, summoning the Praetorian Guard and laying plans for a swift response. Picture the palace corridors, lamps flickering, slaves carrying hurried messages, guards exchanging uneasy glances. Behind every door, someone is choosing a side. Senators who once smiled at Messalina's feasts now mutter about duty and virtue. Courtiers who once sought her favor suddenly rediscover loyalty to Claudius. The air thickens with betrayal, as dangerous as any dagger. Here's a quirky tidbit. Romans sometimes spoke of amicitia, friendship, as a political bond more binding than affection. But in crises like this, amicitia often dissolved overnight. Friends at dinner could be enemies by morning, depending on which way power leaned. Messalina's so-called friends, terrified of being implicated, began to distance themselves so quickly you'd think loyalty was contagious, and they were avoiding infection. Historians still argue whether this conspiracy to bring her down was carefully plotted in advance or hastily improvised once the marriage news broke. Was Narcissus patiently waiting for the perfect misstep? Or did fortune hand him an unexpected weapon? Either way, Messalina's boldness gave her enemies the pretext they craved. Joke number 1. Rome didn't need private investigators. Just wait a day, and your rivals would supply the evidence themselves. Senators convene, their voices tight with indignation. They speak of law, of custom, of loyalty to the emperor, but beneath the rhetoric lies calculation. Claudius's favor is up for grabs, and aligning against Messalina feels safer than defending her. They whisper of her feasts, her lovers, her contests, all repackaged as crimes against the state. The woman who had ruled the night is now cast as a traitor in daylight. Meanwhile, the freedmen advisors argue strategy. Some urge caution, fearing Claudius's affection might shield her. Others, like Narcissus, press for speed. Arrest Silius, isolate Messalina, cut off her escape. Rome has little patience for dithering, and dithering has toppled more emperors than ambition ever did. Joke number 2. If there had been a group chat among Claudius's advisors, the messages would have read, "We need to move now," followed by Narcissus spamming angry mushroom emojis. You can almost hear the hoofbeats again. Messengers racing between barracks and senate houses. The Praetorian Guard, those armored arbiters of Rome's fate, are quietly informed that loyalty today means turning their spears away from the Empress. They obey because loyalty in Rome was rarely to people. It was to power. Messalina, if she hears the stirrings, likely dismisses them at first. She had lived untouchable for so long, shielded by Claudius's tolerance and her own charm. Rivals had gossiped before, and she had survived. Why should this be different? But even she must have felt the chill when courtiers avoided her gaze, when doors closed too quickly, when the usual laughter in her corridors evaporated. Joke number 3. Rome's fastest sport wasn't chariot racing. It was abandoning your ally the moment they get in trouble. And so, her enemies move. Not with swords at first, but with words sharpened into accusations. They tell Claudius that his wife has mocked him publicly, that she has wedded another as if he were already dead, that his authority teeters on ridicule. Whether Claudius believed instantly or whether Narcissus coaxed him, the effect is the same. The emperor's passivity dissolves. Action, at last, must come. By nightfall, the plots are no longer whispers. Arrest warrants are prepared. Silius himself, once the radiant groom, will soon be dragged into custody. Messalina's empire of rumor and pleasure begins to collapse under the weight of political revenge. The woman who once commanded Rome's midnight is now surrounded by enemies who refuse to wait for dawn. The palace corridors no longer echo with music or laughter. Instead, they thrum with a colder sound, the shuffle of armed boots, the whispers of freedmen, the rustle of parchment indictments. Claudius, at last shaken from his studied silence, is confronted with what even he cannot ignore. His Empress, mother of his children, has supposedly married another man. For years he overlooked rumors of feasts, gladiators, and contests. But a wedding? Even Rome's most forgiving husband cannot look away forever. One mainstream historical fact: Tacitus records that Claudius, initially bewildered, had to be convinced of the seriousness of Messalina's marriage. It was his freedman Narcissus who presented the evidence and urged action. Claudius, hesitant and uncertain, finally summoned the Praetorian Guard and demanded answers. The decision to move against Messalina was not born from his own will alone, but from the pressure of advisors who feared both for his reputation and their own survival. Picture the emperor seated in a hall of marble, eyes heavy with confusion. Messalina's name is spoken aloud, her deeds laid bare, her marriage to Silius described in detail. Claudius blinks, as though he cannot reconcile the stories with the woman who shared his table. "Is it true?" he murmurs, and the silence of his advisors is its own answer. Here's a quirky tidbit. Roman law was full of rituals, and divorce itself was surprisingly simple. One party could simply declare the marriage over before witnesses. But for an empress, things were never simple. Her symbolic divorce from Claudius by marrying Silius was seen not just as betrayal of a husband, but of the state. In Rome, personal relationships and politics were braided so tightly that to insult one was to endanger the other. Historians still argue whether Claudius acted out of genuine outrage, political necessity, or sheer manipulation by Narcissus and his allies. Was he finally heartbroken by undeniable betrayal? Or was he frightened into action by those around him who could not afford his inaction? Either way, his confrontation with the truth marks the beginning of Messalina's end. Joke number 1, imagine being Claudius. "So my wife married someone else while I was working?" That's not just adultery, that's bad scheduling. Messalina herself, when confronted, tries the oldest defense: denial and desperation. Sources say she pleaded that the marriage was a sham, a misunderstanding, a performance. Perhaps she wept. Perhaps she shouted. Perhaps both in turn. But her tears, once powerful, now fall into ears already sealed by suspicion. Claudius listens, but the freedmen whisper louder, and the guard's armor clinks like a verdict. The Senate, too, adds its voice. Senators, who once chuckled at her feasts, now demand punishment. They cloak their resentment in language of duty and virtue, but beneath it lies relief. At last, the chance to cut down the woman who mocked their hierarchy, who blurred class lines, who turned Rome's morals into her stage. Joke number 2. If senatorial speeches were Twitter threads, every single one would have started, "As a concerned Roman citizen, I must condemn the Empress." The emperor's household divides. Some slaves remain loyal to Messalina, slipping her news and comfort. Others scurry to Narcissus, eager to save themselves by delivering proof of her indulgences. Claudius, caught between affection and anger, seems paralyzed. He is not a man of swift decisions, and this decision demands a speed he cannot muster. Narcissus, sensing hesitation, seizes more authority, pressing for arrests and trials. And so, Claudius, finally cornered, gives reluctant orders. Silius is to be seized. Messalina is to be stripped of power, her titles and influence removed. What began as whispered rumor now becomes an official act of imperial justice. Joke number 3. Somewhere in the archives, an imperial scribe probably wrote, "Cause of action. Wife accidentally married someone else. Recommendation. Strongly discouraged." The confrontation is not simply between husband and wife. It is between emperor and empress, between state and scandal. Claudius, nudged by his advisors, at last acknowledges that to ignore Messalina any longer would be to mock his own reign. His quiet tolerance turns to cold decree, and the woman who once commanded Rome's midnight is now a prisoner in daylight. But if Claudius has finally spoken, Messalina has not yet lost her voice. Her downfall will not come without pleas, schemes, and last attempts to sway the emperor's heart. Already, she begins to prepare her desperate defense. You feel the air turn metallic, like the breath before a storm. Hours ago, Rome was busy converting rumors into jokes. Now, the jokes lose their nerve. Orders ripple outward from the Palatine. Close gates, summon tribunes, seize papers, arrest names that have been whispered for years but never written down. The city that watched Messalina's nights with a smirk begins watching its own doors with a key. The downfall does not arrive like thunder. It arrives like the steady march of boots. Claudius is no longer alone with his scrolls. You watch, as if from the edge of the room, while the freedman Narcissus draws a tight circle around the emperor. Advisors, captains of the Praetorian Guard, a handful of senators who smell which way the wind now blows. They speak quickly, almost in chorus. No time for dithering, no room for sentiment. A litter is prepared, and Claudius is carried to the barracks where soldiers, not courtiers, will set the rhythm of the day. The message is clear. This will be settled by authority before it is settled by memory. One mainstream historical fact anchors the chaos. Tacitus reports that Narcissus rushed Claudius to the Praetorian camp and ordered immediate arrests, with Gaius Silius seized and executed the same day. No long trial, no public dithering. The consul designate becomes a condemned man in a single arc of the sun. Others close to Messalina fall with him, their fortunes ending as quickly as they were made. In Rome, proximity is always a verdict. In your mind's eye, you track Silius at the moment the net closes. He is not in a shadowed corridor. He is in daylight, handsome, composed, and then astonished as armor flashes around him like a trap sprung. He asks for a hearing. The answer is a blade. He reaches for rank. Rank reaches back with iron. You don't hear his last words over the drum of orders. List the names, search the houses, fetch the letters, and above all, keep Messalina away from the emperor. Here's a quirky tidbit from the paper world of panic. Roman documents lived on wax tablets, and when fear arrived, those tablets met fire. You can smell it now. The sweet salt sting of melting wax as courtiers hover over braziers, editing their diaries in a hurry. Letters are scraped smooth, seals are cracked and reheated. A lifetime of flattery liquefies into anonymous puddles. Congratulations, Rome. You've invented the world's first delete history button. Still, some evidence cannot be burned. Gifts gleam in cupboards. Deeds lie in chests. A pantomime's bracelet, a gladiator's sword, a senator's IOU. Objects with inconvenient memories. Men who once bragged about proximity now practice amnesia with pious faces. A few sprint to Narcissus and recite rehearsed confessions. I was forced. A few try to hide. A few try to pray. And a few, realizing the curtain has fallen, simply sit down and wait for footsteps. Historians still argue whether this purge was a carefully rehearsed plan waiting for its cue, or an improvised stampede choreographed by Narcissus's instinct for survival. Was there a genuine coup in motion around Silius, or did a reckless private ceremony let enemies frame lust as treason? The sources leave room for both readings, and the truth, like a man in crisis, probably ran in two directions at once. You move with the messengers as they stitch the city into a net. At the praetor's door, a knock like a verdict. At a patron's atrium, servants shudder as soldiers cross the mosaic. Down in the theater quarter, a celebrated dancer turns pale. He had thought himself protected by laughter. Protection is a costume that fits poorly under armor. Joke number 1. Rome didn't really need a document shredder. Just a brazier, a guilty conscience, and 5 minutes. Efficiency at its finest. Back at the camp, Claudius watches the machine gather speed. It is tempting to paint him cold. It's more accurate to paint him overwhelmed. He speaks little. Narcissus speaks for him, and every sentence is a gate slamming. Lists are read. Names are crossed out the old-fashioned way, by erasing the people who bear them. The emperor's silence functions like consent, and in Rome, silence can be as loud as drums. Word reaches palace wings that once belonged, by habit, to laughter. Panic climbs the stairwells. Messalina's household fractures into fast categories: the devoted, too few to help; the calculating, suddenly allergic to eye contact; and the practical, packing. Doors that yesterday opened with a glance now jam or creak or never existed in the first place. Even the marbles look away. You step into one of those rooms where men are very busy pretending not to exist. A scribe scrapes wax so hard he gouges the wood beneath. A steward counts coins and then decides to count again. A perfume jar tips and becomes a slick moon on the floor. It is amazing how quickly the furniture of pleasure learns to look like evidence. Joke number 2. Hazard of working in an imperial palace. Your job title can change from cupbearer to witness to accomplice before lunch. Arrests begin to read like a cast list. A famous pantomime is taken. An equestrian official who brokered introductions is led away. A freedman who managed invitations finds his own unceremoniously revoked. Some protest they obeyed Claudius's earlier indulgence. That the Empress was a terrible defense, unavoidable. Narcissus does not argue. He is not here to sift motives. He is here to plug leaks. In this sweep, the city rediscovers its taste for morality. Senators who smiled into Messalina's cups 2 months ago deliver righteous speeches about the sanctity of marriage and the dignity of the throne. Their words are less about virtue than about distance. Every sentence builds a wall between them and a woman falling fast. The same poets who winked yesterday now write dirges for Rome's honor. Storage rooms of indignation empty overnight. You remember how we began? Banquets, contests, rumors that sounded like theater. The theater is closed now. What remains is administration, terrible in its competence. Claudius signs without flourish. Tribunes nod without flourish. Silius's house is inventoried. His statues are sheeted. His friends forget the route to his door. Memory, in a practical city, is a negotiable instrument. Joke number 3. If Rome kept a loyalty punch card, half the court just filled all 10 slots in a single afternoon and redeemed a free conscience. By late day, the purge has a rhythm. The camp receives, the city yields, the palace recedes. And somewhere, just beyond these circuits of power, Messalina herself begins to run out of rooms. She sends messages. She sends tears. She sends the names of children like shields. Some doors open, most do not. The same corridors that once made her queen of night now serve as a maze built for delay. This is the moment the sources narrow to a sharp point. Messalina tries to reach Claudius. hoping that the man who looked away for years will look away once more. But Narcissus anticipates the move. He interposes messengers. He chooses roads. He ensures the Emperor is always elsewhere until elsewhere can finish its work. In one version, Messalina takes refuge in the gardens of Lucullus, a place thick with luxury and ghosts of old triumphs. The choice feels like irony, auditioning for tragedy. And while she prepares words, others prepare outcomes. The soldiers who escorted Silius to death have not even unbuckled their belts. Clerks, still warm from writing one warrant, sharpen their styluses for the next. Claudius, dragged at last into the stream of events, lets the stream pull. Whether from hurt, fear, or the pressure of a court that has decided for him, he does not yet call a halt. You stand at the threshold of the gardens and feel the temperature drop. A woman who turned Rome's knights into legend now practices her most difficult role: penitent, supplicant, mother. It is a part with few lines and a very small audience. Perhaps she gathers her children. Perhaps she gathers her breath. Perhaps she rehearses every sentence that ever saved her. Outside, the city keeps time with iron. The downfall has begun. It is orderly, relentless, and uninterested in the schedule of tears. From here, the story tightens to a single point. No more feasts, no more contests, only a door, a path, and a last attempt to turn an emperor back into a husband. The night will ask for mercy. The morning will answer. You stand at the gate of the gardens of Lucullus as twilight slides across clipped hedges and marble basins. Water keeps its calm counsel, whispering around a statue of a general who once conquered Pontus and then conquered leisure. The air smells faintly of cypress, and this is the Roman way, perfume trying to bribe fate. Tonight the garden is both refuge and witness. Messalina has retreated here, and you follow, quiet as a thought, into the last act of her story. She is not the hostess you have met in rumor. No bracelets, no chorus of music. Her hair is undone, the ancient sign of supplication. Her tunic hangs unbelted. She dictates messages as if breath were currency, and she must spend it all at once. To the emperor, let me speak. To Narcissus, mercy for the children. To any friend, bring him here. Servants sprint and return. Sprint and return, each with the same report. Claudius is at the Praetorian camp, guarded by men who obey Narcissus before tears. The emperor is being carried along by other people's decisions, and the road does not pass by any garden gate. One mainstream historical fact sets the scene. Tacitus, Annals 11, says Messalina was confined in the gardens of Lucullus, while Claudius, steered by the freedman Narcissus, went to the Praetorian barracks. Gaius Silius was executed that same day, and an armed party was sent to the gardens with orders that ended Messalina's life. Tacitus adds the terrible detail that when the moment came, she hesitated to act against herself, and a soldier finished the work. The garden pretends not to hear, but you do. Messalina tries one more tactic. Bring me my children. Octavia and Britannicus, names heavy with Rome's future, are somewhere else, under someone else's command. Perhaps a nurse holds them. Perhaps a chamberlain delays them. Their absence feels like a sentence written in invisible ink. You can't show him the only argument that ever worked. Historians still argue whether she actually succeeded in sending the children to Claudius, or whether Narcissus, anticipating that appeal, kept them carefully apart until the business was done. Here's a quirky tidbit to feel the place under your feet. These very gardens were famous for luxury. Lucullus, the general whose name became a byword for lavish banquets, was credited by later writers with importing cherries and fine fish pond culture to Rome. Imagine the irony. In grounds that taught Rome how to indulge, the woman accused of greatest indulgence waits for judgment. If a place could raise an eyebrow, these paths would. Night thickens. From the city comes the faintest ripple of marching, the metal heartbeat of a decision. You watch Messalina pace under clipped laurels, then stop by a bench where a stylus and tablet lie ready. She writes and rewrites one sentence, as if the right curve of a letter might open a door. Let me speak to the emperor. Someone takes the tablet. Someone does not return. Joke number 1. If Rome had voicemail, Narcissus would be the friend who accidentally never forwards your messages. An old woman, perhaps a freedwoman, who dressed her hair on feast nights, brings a shawl she cannot make Messalina wear. The Empress, who turned rooms into theaters, now sits in a garden that will not clap. She looks not at the palace on the hill, but at the pathway through the hedge, as if Mercy might simply walk in and ask for wine. Meanwhile, the dinner that decides her life is not here. Tacitus paints a scene both chilling and absurd. Claudius, tired of counsel, eats and drinks. Afterward, he wonders aloud if the poor woman should be called tomorrow to defend herself. Narcissus, knowing how quickly pity can resurrect, bolts upright and orders what pity cannot reverse. He dispatches Evidus, another freedman, with a tribune and centurion. Men whose sandals make decisions sound official. They arrive in the garden like a change in weather. Evidus bristles with borrowed authority. The soldiers stand like commas at the end of a sentence everyone understands. He speaks harshly. Tacitus says he poured out insults, as if cruelty could serve as proof of righteousness. A sword glints without theatrics. A small table is cleared. A dagger is placed where everyone can see it. Rome, that city of staged courage, now asks a woman to perform the ugliest courage of all. Messalina takes the blade. Her hand, so often steady in directing evenings and allies, wavers. The body remembers it is animal and flinches from its own end. She tries. Tacitus says she tries and fails to press deep. A soldier steps forward. You look away. The garden hears the smallest gasp, then folds the sound into leaf and water so it will not echo. Joke number 2. Small and dark around the edges, because Rome insists on irony. Somewhere a clerk is already drafting the line, "Justice was done," while he still has gravy on his sleeve. Bureaucracy keeps its appetite. And then there is that other dinner, the one with the mushrooms. Suetonius later makes mushrooms the instrument of Claudius's own death. A detail too neat not to remember here. Some versions of tonight suggest Claudius asked for more wine after hearing, that he ate, that he slept, that the next morning he asked, "Is the poor woman to come?" A question Narcissus spared him from answering. Historians still argue whether the emperor truly wavered, or whether such anecdotes are moral staging to show how far servants could steer a ruler. Either way, your breath catches at the picture. A husband moving from desert to widowhood without changing rooms. The soldiers wait until the garden is quiet. They do not linger. Rome's endings are efficient when they must be. Evotus wipes his hands with the importance of a man who has borrowed history's pen. The tribune counts the forms of obedience. Order delivered, order done, report to follow. The path that brought them in is the path they take out. No one speaks the name that once carried feasts out past dawn. Joke number 3. The minutes of the meeting could read, Agenda, resolve imperial domestic issue. Outcome, decisive. Catering, excellent. Rome never met a tragedy it couldn't summarize dryly. You remain, because the garden remains. It is the only witness that cannot be bribed or promoted. Moonlight picks out the dagger's dull shine. A breeze tidies the cypress. A fountain continues its polite applause for no one. The woman who once turned night into a stage leaves no curtain call, only a rumor given a body and then taken away again. What do you do with this ending? Perhaps you remember what we said at the start. Sources sharpen their knives with poetry as much as with facts. Even here, at the last, the scene is half document, half choreography. Was the plea for the children real or dramatized later? Did Claudius falter, or was that generosity added by writers who liked their emperors credulous? Historians still argue whether this death was justice, convenience, or the final act of a story men needed to tell about a dangerous woman. You turn toward the hedge gate. Outside, the city will wake to news already shaped. The Empress is gone. The Emperor is safe. Rome is restored to dignity. Or so the proclamations will say. Inside, water keeps speaking its soft syllables to stone. No herb or charm saved her. None could, because tonight was not a fever of the body, but a choice of the state. The garden exhales. You do too. The path ahead leads to aftermath. How Rome remembers, forgets, edits, and reuses a life until it fits the moral it prefers. For now, you walk out under the cypresses and let the night close softly behind you. Messalina's voice falls quiet, but her echo does not. It follows you toward a city already rehearsing the story it will believe. Dawn lifts over Rome like a curtain that forgot the play has ended. You walk the streets as shutters open. Vendors wrestle their stalls upright, and a boy with ink-stained fingers hurries toward the forum, carrying a board for the Acta Diurna. The official notices will speak of appointments and repairs, perhaps a sacrifice well received. They will not write what everyone is saying. The Empress is dead. The consul designate is dead. The night has been trimmed to fit the daylight of law. You feel the news move faster than carts, quieter than footsteps, heavier than bronze. A freedman brushes past you, muttering, "It's done," the way people say the weather has changed. By the time you reach the Palatine slopes, slaves already sweep courtyards as if dust were guilty. A few ladies at their balconies keep their faces arranged for propriety and their eyes arranged for gossip. Rome does not stop for tragedy. It merely absorbs it, like stone taking polish. One mainstream historical fact steadies the morning. Tacitus reports that Gaius Silius was executed the same day. Claudius learned of the marriage, and that Messalina, confined in the gardens of Lucullus, was put to death by an armed party, while the emperor remained under the management of his freedman Narcissus. There is even the cold afterthought that later, Claudius asked whether the poor woman should be summoned, proof that decisions sometimes outrun the men who own them. The palace behaves like an office after a scandal, efficient, embarrassed, hungry. Seals are pressed to wax, inventories drafted, houses sealed. You catch the faint clink of a statue's diadem being lifted off and set aside, not smashed. Rome prefers revision to chaos. A steward whispers that the images of the Empress will be respecified, which is a very Roman way of saying that marble can forget names if paid to. Here's a quirky tidbit about the theater of mourning. Elite Romans often signaled grief by changing grooming. Men let beards grow out or clothed themselves in darker togas, and households lowered their noise like a dimmer switch. Today, however, you see something stranger, a careful not mourning. Too much sorrow looks suspicious, too much cheer heartless. Courtiers choose the middle distance, practicing the face that says, "I heard a rumor last week and had already adjusted my feelings." Historians still argue whether Messalina's memory suffered a formal damnatio memoriae or an informal one. Were her inscriptions systematically erased? Or did Rome simply choke her name out of polite air? Some stones seem to have swallowed letters. Others keep their silence honestly, because nothing was ever carved. Either way, what the city cannot erase, it will outtalk. Claudius, you are told, returns to the palace, not triumphal, but rounded by exhaustion. He eats, he drinks, he allows advisors to line his day with decisions like paving stones, confiscations ratified, accomplices punished, household rearranged. He does not walk toward the gardens. He does not ask to see her. The freedmen, especially Narcissus, keep him moving like a raft on a river whose banks they control. Joke number 1. Ancient Rome proves the oldest corporate wisdom. Control the calendar. Control the boss. You pass a bookseller's stall where yesterday's verses about Messalina are already being rehearsed as prophecy. See, a listener says, the poets knew. Of course they knew. Poets write endings first and then go looking for causes. Across the way, a mime troupe rehearses a new scene. A veiled woman, a ring presented and snatched back, a clown emperor counting mushrooms while a clerk shakes his head. The audience laughs, soft and guilty. Satire does not pause for condolences. In a shaded portico, 2 senators converse with the gravity of men who have just avoided drowning. Shameful, says one. Necessary, says the other. Both are right. Both are wrong. Neither is brave enough to wonder aloud what their own sons were doing last month under those infamous lamps. You sense how quickly moral clarity blooms after danger passes. Joke number 2. Nothing improves a Roman's virtue like someone else's indictment. Word slides through the city that Messalina's mother, Domitia Lepida, had been present near the end. An old enmity set aside for the final duty of spurring courage when courage won't come. Was she really there? Tacitus places her at the threshold of the last act, urging a dignified exit. Other tellings hesitate, preferring to keep the Empress alone for the theater of it. Historians still argue whether Lepida's figure is fact or arrangement, a mother introduced by the narrative to remind readers that even legends have parents who frown. You pause before a shuttered door. Inside lies whatever the city will allow of a body, quiet, unadorned. There will be burial, though not spectacle. There will be words, though not inscriptions. A nurse passes with a child's toy tucked under her shawl, fast and invisible. If Octavia or Britannicus ask questions, answers will be managed. In this family, children are briefed like generals. The morning stretches, Claudius signs. The guard rotates posts. Accomplices remember things that flatter justice. A certain bracelet changes wrists. A certain townhouse changes owners. A certain actor quietly decides to try his luck in Antioch. The empire, which last night discovered moral principle, today rediscovers logistics. And already, the story tries on its next costume. In a few years, 49 CE to be precise, Claudius will marry Agrippina the Younger, mother of a boy named Nero. The boy will be adopted into the imperial line. Octavia, Messalina's daughter, will marry him. Britannicus, Messalina's son, will fade toward a fate the sources describe in tones meant to sound impartial. The palace that devoured an empress will keep eating. This, too, is legacy. You step into a small shrine off the street and light a pinch of incense because the room expects it. The smoke rises like a footnote. You think of how Rome will remember Messalina as a caution, a caricature, a necessary purge, a poem that sold well. You think of how she will survive in the very voices that condemned her. Juvenal's sneer, Tacitus's cool blade, Suetonius's appetite for tidbits. None of them met her. All of them outlived her. Joke number 3. In Rome, the three immortals are Marble, Rumor, and the man with a stylus. By noon, the city hums at its usual frequency. Bakers shout, donkeys complain, fountains throw their handfuls of silver into the sun. But if you listen beneath the ordinary, you can hear the soft clatter of a story locking into place. A life has been reduced to moral grammar. Excess, hubris, downfall. Convenient, teachable, neat. Too neat, perhaps. Historians still argue whether we know Messalina at all, or only know our own nerves, reflected in a woman, onto whom men projected appetite and fear. You turn toward the hill and feel how quickly aftermath hardens into legend. Statues will not speak. Scrolls will speak too much. Gardens will say the least and best. Tonight Rome will sleep, fitfully, smugly, anxiously, under proclamations that insist dignity has been restored. Tomorrow, another appetite will wake, and another poem will sharpen. This is how cities keep time. And you, who have walked her night from rumor to sentence, now stand at the threshold of memory. The last curtain has dropped, but the encore is centuries long. Painters, playwrights, historians, and hosts like me will keep unrolling this reel, pausing to point, to doubt, to grin, to sigh. In the next and final section, you will look straight at that reel. What sticks, what slips, what we inherit when we say her name. The stage is empty, but the script won't close. The story has wound itself through banquets and gardens, through satire and swords. And now you stand in the long corridor of memory. Messalina's gone, her body silenced, her lovers erased, her name trimmed from inscriptions like ivy scraped off marble. Yet somehow, she is more present than ever. Rome has a talent for this, turning scandal into scripture, exaggeration into inheritance. You feel the city still buzzing, even centuries later, in every line of Juvenal, every sigh of Tacitus, every whisper carried forward by historians who can't resist a legend of excess. One mainstream historical fact frames this legacy. In the centuries after her death, Messalina became a shorthand for lust and corruption. Medieval chronicles, Renaissance plays, and even 19th century novels dragged her name out whenever writers wanted to personify dangerous female appetite. The Victorian historian Thomas Babington Macaulay once called her the Imperial Messalina, lumping her with every woman who had ever made men nervous. Her reputation outlived Rome itself, but what was inherited was not the woman, it was the caricature. To later ages, Messalina was less a person than a cautionary tale, proof that desire unleashed could topple empires. The details, whether she truly competed with courtesans, whether she really prowled brothels, whether the marriage to Silius was strategy or madness, all blurred into one word, Messalina, equal parts insult and myth. Here's a quirky tidbit. In early modern France, playwrights even staged comedies with Messalina as a stock character, the lustful Empress. Recognizable instantly to audiences who had never read Tacitus. Imagine buying a ticket, finding your seat, and watching an actress in a crown wink at gladiators while the audience cackled. That is how a Roman scandal survived into Parisian theaters. Historians still argue whether she was victim or villain. Was she truly insatiable? Or did Tacitus and Juvenal invent her excess to shame Claudius and warn Rome against female power? Some scholars suggest she was a pawn of political enemies. Others that she was reckless enough to write her own downfall. Each camp produces footnotes, but all agree on one point. We know Messalina mostly through the pens of men who had something to gain by scorning her. You picture her walking again, not through the gardens of Lucullus this time, but through the centuries. Her image painted by Renaissance artists, her name invoked in Victorian sermons, her scandals dusted off by modern documentaries. She has become a traveling exhibit, a mirror for each generation's fears about women, power, and desire. The woman is gone. The symbol has tenure. Joke number 1. If Messalina had collected royalties every time her name was used as shorthand for lustful woman, her descendants could have bought half of Europe. You think of Claudius, too. Bookish, mocked, devoted to aqueducts and mushrooms. His reign survived her scandal, though his reputation was never free of it. Some say he mourned, others say he remarried too quickly to notice. But his silence ensured that the legend of Messalina was shaped not by husband or children, but by enemies with styluses sharper than swords. And then you remember her children. Octavia, her daughter, would marry Nero and suffer in her own way, exiled and executed by the man who had once been her stepbrother. Britannicus, her son, would be quietly poisoned at age 14 to clear Nero's path. Messalina's line endured only long enough to be consumed by the same cycle of rumor and politics that devoured her. Perhaps that is the truest Roman inheritance. Dynasties as banquets that always end in someone else clearing the table. Joke number 2. In a city obsessed with omens, the fact that Lucullus introduced cherries to Rome feels symbolic. Sweet fruit imported, enjoyed, and then devoured quickly. Messalina, too, was an exotic sweetness that Rome claimed and then consumed. As centuries passed, the judgment stuck harder than the evidence. Historians compiled lists of Rome's bad women, and Messalina's name always sparkled near the top, sometimes outshining Cleopatra or Agrippina. Plays, novels, and films gave her silk costumes, sinister smiles, and endless lovers. Rarely did they ask what she thought, what she felt, what her silences meant. To survive as a legend in Rome was to lose your voice. Yet here, at the quiet end of your walk, you wonder, what if some of the rumors were true, but not all? What if she was guilty of passion, but innocent of caricature? What if Rome's real crime was not her appetite, but its refusal to imagine an empress with choices beyond husband or villainous? Historians still argue whether she was exceptional or simply exceptionally slandered. You are left, as always, with fragments and echoes. Joke number 3. If ancient Rome had PR managers, Messalinas would still be working overtime today, frantically issuing scrolls titled, "Actually, it's more complicated." The path ends here, in reflection. You've walked through her nights of rumor, her days of satire, her marriage that mocked law, her downfall in gardens, and her survival in legend. She was feared, mocked, condemned, and yet immortalized. A life compressed into a cautionary headline that never stopped running. And so you lie back now, letting the story settle like dust in a sunbeam. The queen of sexual deviance in Rome is gone, but her name still lingers on lips, proving how easily desire can be made into history, and history into lullaby. The story of Messalina has ended, but the night still holds you gently. The gardens of Lucullus are quiet now, their fountains whispering, their cypress trees leaning into darkness. The feasts, the gladiators, the dancers, the hurried whispers of freedmen, they have all slipped away into silence. What remains is only the slow rhythm of your own breathing, steady, as if Rome itself has finally calmed. Let the sharp edges of the tale soften. No more marble halls or clattering sandals. No more accusations or satire. Just the hush of a city at rest. The lamps guttering into embers, the streets cooling under starlight. Imagine yourself lying back on a simple couch, a soft blanket drawn close, listening to the faintest hum of wind. Take a deep breath in, hold it gently, release it as though you were letting go of every fragment of rumor, every restless thought. Let your mind wander through a garden not of scandal, but of peace. Lavender, rosemary, chamomile, herbs swaying lightly in the night air. These are not the herbs of Messalina's banquets, but of rest, comfort, and dreams. Your eyelids feel heavier, your body softer against the bed. The voices of Rome fade, like a crowd dispersing after a performance. The story has been told, and now the city sleeps, and so should you. Each breath draws you further into calm, as if you are floating on a quiet river that carries you gently forward without effort. If the world presses against you with noise tomorrow, remember this stillness tonight. Remember that even Rome's loudest scandals dissolve into silence when night deepens. You are safe, you are resting, and you are already drifting.